Chapter 10 looks at food safety management systems. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about methods for achieving active managerial control. We're going to talk about public health interventions of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. We're going to talk about the 7 HACCP principles for preventing foodborne illness. We're going to talk about specialized processes that will require a variance, how to prepare for, respond to, and recover from a crisis, how to respond to a foodborne illness outbreak, and how to respond to imminent health hazards like power outages, fire, flood, water interruption, or sewage issues. So what is food safety management systems? Food safety management systems are practices and procedures that are meant to be proactive to help prevent foodborne illness. So in food safety management systems, we are looking for ways to control or minimize the risks and hazards throughout that flow of food that we've talked about in the previous chapters. So we've gone through the flow of food. Now we got to look at the paperwork side of how we look at that flow of food and how we can prevent potential foodborne illness from happening at all steps of the flow of food. So when you look at this foundation, we got to have a personal hygiene program. We need to have a food safety training program. Of course, in Illinois, if you are handling food, every person that handles food is required to have at least the basic food handler's license. And you're supposed to have at least one person while the restaurant's open that has the manager, the advanced license that you will be taking the test for at the end of this class. So, but it never hurts to have supplemental information that's specific to your business and stuff as well. So a food safety training program. You need to have a program for how you select your suppliers and what your specifications are for each, and you'll love this, each individual item that you purchase. All right. Give you an example. I can say I want a case of potatoes. Well, that doesn't tell me a whole lot. So you need to have a specification put together for your potatoes, and then what your criteria is as far as supplier selection. We need to make sure we have a program for quality control and assurance, making sure we're having a great product all the time. We need to have a cleaning and sanitizing program. We need to, of course, have standard operating procedures. We'll get into that a lot more in the CA 211, which is the hospitality management class, but it is something that is part of this system. We need to have a facility design and equipment maintenance program, making sure our equipment is kept top notch. And we also need to have a pest control program. So these are different systems that need to be put in place for us to be able to work efficiently. So what is active managerial control? Right? So if you remember, we talked about, and this many moons ago, it seems like, we talked about the 5 common risk factors for foodborne illness. So one is purchasing food from unsafe locations, failing to cook food adequately, holding food incorrectly, using contaminated equipment, and practicing poor personal hygiene. So what we're looking to do is figure out ways to actually minimize those risks and make sure that as managers that we are controlling these factors for foodborne illness, and not just us sitting in the office and playing solitaire or whatever, but that we're out there and we're observing and we're training and we're correcting mistakes and we're reinforcing and we're doing all these different things. And that's just from a sanitation perspective. That doesn't include the management perspective. My running joke is, as far as being a chef, not only do you have to be a great cook, you also have to be a great manager. And, food is easy. Food doesn't talk back to you. It doesn't show up late, doesn't have an attitude or anything. It's the human side of it that becomes more problematic, that we have to make sure we are managing what is going on from our business from a sanitation standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a procedural standpoint, all these different things that you are looking at all at the same time. It all intertwines together, but that's part of being a chef. And if you want to be a restaurant owner, it makes it even more interesting, because not only are you looking at what's going on in the kitchen, you're also looking at what's going on in the front of the house. Front of the house manager has their responsibilities, chef has their responsibilities, but the owner then oversees all of it to make sure it happens. So we need to make sure that we are actively controlling these issues so we prevent and minimize the risk of foodborne illness. So, like I've said in many different lectures, the premise behind this is that we are being proactive rather than reactive. So we anticipate where the issues are, where the potential issues are, and then we plan for them and how to avoid them, or if something happened, how we correct it so we're not necessarily wasting product. All right. So what we need to look at are different ways that we can achieve managerial control. So training programs is one area, manager supervision, creating standard operating procedures, and then of course, HACCP is a big one, especially from the sanitation side. So how do we implement managerial control? So the first thing we need to do is we need to identify where there are potential risks and document those, of course, and look at ways to control or eliminate them. And again, I'm talking with you today specifically about sanitation risks. Okay. When you look at it from a manager standpoint, you're going to look at it from a different perspective. But in today's lecture, in this class, we're looking at the risks from a sanitation standpoint. All right. We need to then look at monitoring critical activities. We've talked about some of those critical activities. Everything from when the food is being received, does it come in at the proper temperature? Is it being held properly? Is it in the temperature danger zone when it shouldn't be? Are your cooks leaving the product out in the temperature danger zone when they shouldn't be for too long a period of time? Are things temping correctly? Are they too low, too high? Where are these things at? We're looking at all potential critical activities, and we need to find and create a procedure on how to monitor those. Of course, another part then is correcting improper procedures or behaviors. So if there happens to be issues, that we take a stance to correct that procedure and hopefully get it to the correct behavior that is needed as part of our standard operating procedure. We're going to need to also verify that the policies, procedures, and corrective actions are followed. So we, in essence, in some instances, get to be the babysitter, making sure that, yes, we've written all this stuff out, and they're great plans, but if your staff doesn't follow them or do anything of them, you just waste a bunch of time. So you have to make sure that what you've put in place is actually being done. Now, as part of that, we need to also make sure that we are giving our employees the proper training to make sure that they can do it effectively. You don't want to just say, oh, here's a new system, go for it, without giving them the proper training. You want to teach them how it needs to be done according to whatever policies and procedures have been put in place for your establishment. And then also, if you find that employees are lacking in areas, how do you go about doing some retraining to correct some of the bad behavior? Okay. And then, of course, we need to make sure that from time to time, we're assessing the systems and making sure that they're working, because the last thing we want to do is put a system in place that does nothing for us. Because that's the thing, is we don't put these systems in just to kill time. We put these systems in to make sure that we are minimizing the risk to our customers, to our employees, to our livelihood. And so we need to make sure, once we have it off and running, that we're checking to make sure that, hey, this is working really well, or yeah, this is not doing what we intended. It's really not helping. We need to revamp it. We just need to make sure that we're not doing it just because we said we had to do it. But we need a reason, and making sure it's giving us the data that we need for what we have going in. Okay, so when we look at the FDA, they provide different recommendations for controlling risk factors. These are considered called public health interventions. No, we're not going to put you in a room with all of us in there and have that type of intervention. But these are guidelines that the FDA put out that should be demonstrated and known to make sure that you are doing what you can to keep people safe from a sanitation standpoint. So first and foremost, as a manager, you need to have a demonstration of knowledge, which means you need to be able to show that you know what you're doing to keep food safe. So this certification is one way, but you have to remember when you're taking like the test, you're not just taking the test and cramming for the test just for the test. Those numbers need to stick. When we say, chicken has to be cooked to 165 degrees for less than a second, that's just not for you to remember for test number 1, test number 2, or your final, or for the ServSafe test. That is for you to stick in your head. So when you are running a kitchen and you're looking at somebody cooking a chicken breast, hey, that needs to be cooked to 165 degrees before it goes out to my customer. So it's going to be safe. So you have to be able to demonstrate that you have this sanitation knowledge and you're not just learning it for this class and then never using it again, because that will definitely not happen, especially once you get started in the kitchens with us next semester. We also got to look at staff health controls. So those are procedures put in place to make sure that we have good personal hygiene going on. So, what is the requirements? And this should all be part of when a new employee hires on, they have the employee handbook. All this should be in there. Employee handbook we'll talk about in management class, different class. But the health control should be part of it. What's the policy for reporting illnesses? What's the policy for making sure that, as far as any time off, things like that, that's in the management side, but we need to make sure the health controls, how we, expectations of personal hygiene. What is the uniform requirement? What is the grooming requirements? All those things you need to make sure you have in writing, and that the employees understand that this is the requirement, and you need to, like we said earlier, making sure you're following through with it too. We need to figure out programs for controlling hands as a vehicle of contamination. Remember, we want to try to prevent bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods. All right. And so whether it's tongs to handle ready-to-eat foods, like you see in the picture there, or spoons, ladles, you're wearing gloves. Again, we want to make sure that our hands are not making people sick because we're cross-contaminating product. Okay. We need to make sure that we have policies and procedures in place for time and temperature parameters, because we want to make sure we're controlling those pathogens. So we want to make sure we're putting in writing how we limit the time food that spends in the temperature danger zone, making sure we're requiring all of our cooks and such to check temperatures of food, as an example, as part of the process to ensure that our product is still being safe. And then consumer advisories, we need to make sure that we're providing those notices if you serve raw or undercooked menu items, just like we talked about in chapter 9. Remember, that is not saying you can't, but that, hey, if you're going to order your steak rare, you understand that there is an inherent risk with it because it is cooked less than what the minimum safe temperature is for cooking product. Okay. So those are things that the FDA looks at from a broad scale, and really kind of breaks down those different areas that you need to be thinking about from a sanitation perspective, as far as how we can create that safe environment within the kitchen. Okay. I've been talking about it for many chapters, and it's kind of weird that they put it all the way back to chapter 10, especially since they reference it, but here it is. HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. So that is HACCP. I'm going to tell you for sure, it will probably be on tests. What is HACCP? And, not only, but what's it stand for? What does it mean? Okay. So, and I've talked to you about it already in other chapters, But again, so some of this might seem a little bit of a review, but that's good because we need you to be familiar with it and start to become accustomed to it, because it is something that you will be experiencing as part of your life running kitchens. So what HACCP does is it identifies hazards at different points within the flow of the operation. That could be biological hazards, chemical hazards, and or physical hazards. And then once we've identified those potential problems, we look at how do we prevent, eliminate, or reduce these hazards to a safe level. So instead of not looking at it, not worrying about it, all of a sudden we go, oh shoot, we're having issues with this stage in the process. We look at, okay, where are the potential issues that we need to address, and let's address them as part of the procedure, as part of the recipe, as part of the SOP that's going on for these different areas. So in order to be effective, HACCP has to be based on a written plan. And if anyone's ever done HACCP before, if you don't like writing, I'm really sorry, because it is a written plan, and it is specific to each facility. So it's tough to do a cookie cutter. Now, chain restaurants have a slight advantage because they can do some slight cookie cuttering because of the setup, but there's usually some minuscule things that need to be revamped because maybe the location, the building size, how product comes in, based upon the area that they're at and restrictions or whatever that they might have. So a system is prepared for a specific location, and just because it works for one location, it's not cookie cutter. It's not necessarily going to work for somebody else. So the 7 principles are: the first thing is you conduct a hazard analysis. From there, you determine the critical control points, CCPs. You establish what's called critical limits. Then you establish monitoring procedures. So you put together a policy on how you're going to monitor. You identify any corrective actions if the critical limits are not met. You implement it. Then you verify that it works. And then you establish procedures to be able to keep records and to document the things that you are actually doing. So those are the 7 principles. So the first thing is conduct a hazard analysis. So what we do is we look at every single menu item, and we start to identify where are there potential hazards in that food being served and how we process it. So you can see we've got salads and cold sandwiches. There's some potential issues at the preparation stage and the service stage. Grilled chicken sandwiches and burgers, you have some potential issues at preparing stage, cooking stage, serving stage. Soups, chilies, and sausage, you have potential issues at the preparation stage, the cooking stage, the holding stage, the cooling stage, the reheating stage, and the serving stage. So you're identifying every single TCS food item and determining where those hazards are likely to occur. And remember, you're not only looking for time temperature abuse as far as biological, but you're also looking to see if there's any issues potentially with chemical or physical contaminants. Where could there be issues on those ends as well, depending on what stage of the process you are in. So now that you've did an analysis and you've seen, okay, here are my TCS foods. With these TCS foods, here are the areas where we really need to look at because these are potential critical control points, potential issues. Now we're going to determine the critical control points. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the point in the process where the hazard could be prevented, eliminated, or reduced. That is a critical control point. All right. And depending, there could be more than one critical control point. It's not just a one and done. You could have multiple critical control points during that part of the process, depending on what's going on when it comes to that. We've established the critical control points. Now for each of those control points, we have to establish a critical limit, whether it's a minimum or a maximum. So we set these limits for preventing or eliminating hazards or reducing it. Most of the time, critical limits are time and or temperature based. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's what we can control. So we are going to look at how we can control those critical control points with a time or temperature. Right. So you can see in this thing, it's saying, 16 minutes is the critical limit for whatever this critical control point may be. Right. So it could be time, like the chilling of food, it's time and temperature. Critical control point is the soup must be cooled from 135 to 70 within 2 hours, and it must be from 70 to 41 within additional 4 hours. So right there, you didn't think of it that way, but you have a potential critical control point there as far as your product and the cooling, and there's your critical limit. So in that case, and in most cases, the critical limits are already given to you in one way, shape, or form. You've learned them in previous chapters. Now we just have to apply them to our everyday work that we're doing in the kitchen. So we've established our critical limits. Now we also have to establish monitoring procedures. So that is how we're going to check to see if those critical limits are being met or not. So what is the best way? Is it through thermometer? Is it through the clock? Is it through how you keep the record of what time it went in, what temperature it's at? How are you going to monitor to make sure those points are being met at what they need to be? And we then have to make sure that they're being consistently met, because, we want to make sure that every time that we're producing this, that we are minimizing the risk of somebody getting sick because how they eat it. Right? The other thing we have to do in the monitoring process is we have to identify who is going to monitor them. And the thing is, it shouldn't be the chef that does all the monitoring. And it shouldn't be the sous chef, the assistant manager in the kitchen, that does all the monitoring. Break that up. Make sure that your cooks, your dishwashers, all of your staff have a part in monitoring HACCP areas. Like you see with the chicken breast, monitoring, checking that chicken breast, making sure it's get up to 165 for less than a second, right? It doesn't make sense for the chef or the sous chef to walk over and temp that chicken. The grill cook, that should be that person's responsibility as part of their station, is monitoring that critical control point at the cooking phase to make sure that the chicken reaches a minimum internal temperature of 165 degrees for less than a second. All right. But as the chef, you have to, even before that chicken breast goes on the grill, even before the chicken breast comes into your kitchen, you need to come up with the plan. And part of that is to identify in writing who's responsible for that stuff, who's responsible for making sure that is temped out correctly. So these are things that you have to think about when it comes to your HACCP plans and making sure the food that's coming in is safe. If the unthinkable happens and it doesn't meet the critical measure, then what do you do? Well, if it doesn't meet that critical limit, we have to identify corrective actions. And the thing is, we're thinking about it now. We're not like, crap, the chicken breast is only at 145. Now what do we do? If you've done your HACCP plan correctly, Principle 5 comes into play, and you've already thought about, okay, if this happens, here's what we're going to do about it. All right. So for example, using the chicken breast again, if it's only at 145, what's the corrective action? Cook it longer until it reaches 165. Now, not all of them are as black and white as that, but you get the gist, hopefully, when it comes to, these different items. And the fact that we're thinking about this ahead of time. And then the other thing too, with corrective actions, there could be a couple different options, that there could be a couple of different options that we could do to make sure we're at a point where we don't have to throw away the product because it's been outside that critical limit for too long and we end up having to pitch it because of policies and such. Right? But these are things that you're doing even before the chicken breast even comes in your door. So we implement these processes. Now we have to determine if the plan is working as intended. We evaluate the plan, looking at charts, records, and hazard analysis. We determine if our plans prevent, reduce, or eliminate identified hazards. So we got it all in position, and we're starting it, it's going, do we notice that, hey, these are good systems, our employees are following them, we are looking at ways that we manage. Now, hopefully it's not an idea of, oh, we gave food poisoning to a dozen people last week. Now that we have HACCP in place, only 2 people are getting food poisoning in a week. That's, if you're at that point, we've got bigger problems. And we need to go somewhere else besides, talking about HACCP. But, we're hopefully that there's not going to be any issues to begin with. And these are just helping to reinforce these are good policies, these are good procedures, these are ways that we can help to prevent our customers from getting sick. And then on the other part of the backside is we have to establish a procedure for record keeping and documentation. And we need to keep records, to monitor activities. We need to have records of corrective actions that we took. We need to make sure we're validating equipment. So checking for working condition, making sure our equipment is still in good working order and doing what it's supposed to do. And we also need to have records for working with our suppliers as far as invoices, specifications, things along that line. So let's use a HACCP example here, fruit basket. So in this example, the fruit basket is a fruit only operation. And it's known for its signature item, the melon medley salad. Melon medley salad. Whew, that is definitely a tongue twister, right? So the first step that we have to do is we have to analyze the hazards for the salad. And again, that's just for the salad. That doesn't include anything else that this operation has. This is just for the salad. So the hazards, the salad has fresh watermelon, honeydew, cantaloupe. Ooh. We know that cut melons, all 3 of those, are TCS foods because bacteria can pose a risk to those fresh cut melons once we cut them open, right? So that's an analysis of the melon medley salad. Okay? Now that we've analyzed the hazard, now we set up critical control points, CCPs. So we know that the melons are prepped, held, and served without cooking, right? I don't think we're going to cook the melons, especially if it's a fruit basket type thing, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to then look at, okay, how are we prepping and how are we holding these items? Those are our 2 big critical control points because we don't have to worry about cooking. That's not an area that we're working with because we're not cooking them. So we've looked at and we said, okay, we're going to take care of those. So the first thing would be cleaning and drying the melon surface during prep would reduce the bacteria on the outside. And holding the melon at the correct temperature could prevent bacteria growth. So those are a couple of critical control points that we can use to help prevent somebody getting sick from eating this melon medley salad. All right, so we've identified the critical control points. So in the preparation part, where our critical limit is met because we're going to wash, scrub, and dry the whole melons. Okay, so that's what they are setting up as far as the critical limit. Then they've also, and this is something that says in the book, when they're doing this, they're not just saying, hey, wash, scrub, and dry. They're actually creating a standard operating procedure on how they expect every employee to wash, scrub, and dry the melon. Because no matter who is taking care of that melon, it should all be done the same. And the only way you can do that is by establishing standard operating procedures and requiring that all of your staff follow those SOPs, right? Okay. For the holding, it's a salad, it's a TCS food. So we need to make sure that as part of a critical limit, that it's held at 41 degrees or below because of the cut melon, because the TCS food. So those are the 2 critical limits for those items. An SOP set up for washing, scrubbing, and drying the melons during the prep to reduce the bacteria and holding the cut melons at 41 degrees or lower because that's outside of the temperature danger zone. We've gotten that in place. The next step then is we have to establish what our procedures are for monitoring the salad. So in this case, they're saying that the team leader should monitor the salad's critical limits. That's their responsibility, is monitoring the critical limits of the salad. So in this case, and again, this is all in writing, the team leader makes sure the salad is prepped the correct way. So all steps from the standard operating procedure is being followed. And then they monitor the temperature of those salads, and they're doing it 3 times a day. So you see the picture of the person that is sticking the thermometer in the fruit. So I'm assuming that they're double checking to make sure that melon medley salad is at 41 degrees or below. So they are making sure that it's not going to be an issue for when somebody orders it. So again, what happens if it doesn't work out and there's doesn't meet critical limits? Well, you identify corrective actions. So for melons that had dirt on it still, rewash the melons. You know, if that's the case and they had to rewash the melons, then part of the SOP is that the team leader needs to approve the melon before they're sliced. If you have to take a corrective action, you want to make sure that whoever's doing it is doing it correctly, because you might find the reason why there's still dirt on it is they're not following the standard operating procedure. And then you have to look at, from a manager perspective, different class, how you train or retrain. All right. See, it ties in together. Gotta love it. For the holding temperature, if the temperature inside, the internal temperature of that melon stuff is above 41, you want to make sure that the team leader is checking the cooler, the temperature of every thing in the cooler. Any salad that is above 41 must be thrown out. And here's the reason why. We don't know how long it's been above 41. You know, that's the kicker, is unless you have detailed records that show that, 30 minutes ago, an hour ago, it was at, 39, then, if you check it, a couple hours later and you see it's at 41, you do have a little bit within time temperature to get it back down as corrective action. But unless you have those detailed results, if you don't know how long it's been at 41, the old saying goes, when in doubt, throw it out. Okay. So that is what they're going to be. That's what they won't say, when in doubt, throw it out. But in the SOP, it's going to say that, as part of corrective action, if its salad is above 41 degrees, it must be discarded. So we then have to verify things working. So the team leaders look at the check sheets at the end of each shift. So making sure that they're being filled out, that the temperatures and times and everything are being recorded, and that a lot of times you have them initial it, so it's not just some random person, but you can actually go back to the person if there's questions. And then you confirm that all corrective actions have been taken and recorded. So if you have to do a corrective action like throw out the fruit from one of the dishes, it needs to be recorded. And so people know, and they can also make sure that gets applied to the fact that they don't have, let's say, one less of it because they had to pitch it because it didn't meet the critical limit. Okay. Then in this example, the fruit basket establishment, they evaluate their HACCP system quarterly to make sure everything still makes sense and that they are all their ducks in a row and that they don't need to do any updates or anything like that. And if they do have to do updates, they get them in a fairly regular basis. Then they establish procedures for record keeping. All HACCP records must be maintained for 16 weeks and kept on file. Now, how they're kept is going to be up to the individual establishments. A lot of places are still doing pen and paper and like logbooks and stuff, but you also have digital options. Here in our program, each of our kitchens and our prep kitchen has an iPad. that is connected to our website that allows the students to do daily temperature checks, to do cleaning assignments and schedules, and making sure that things are being done on a regular basis. So we keep ours digitally, so we don't have to worry about where we're going to physically store this information if the health department comes in and they want to see our records. But if you're still doing it pen and paper, you need to make sure you have a space for your records and that you hold them for whatever time it needs to be held for. So we talked about this a little bit last chapter, but just to kind of reiterate, if you are doing some of these methods, it's going to require a variance and almost certainly a HACCP plan. All right. It says may in Illinois, if you're doing one of these things, you will have to make a HACCP plan for it. I can tell you that right now. All right. So like we said, if we're trying to smoke food to preserve it, not just to enhance the flavor, if we're using food additives or compounds like vinegar to preserve or alter food, so we're going to make our pickles, but not because we like the taste, but because we want to keep them at room temperature instead of in the refrigerator, then we have to have a variance and a HACCP plan on how we're going to prevent people from getting sick through critical control points and critical limits. If you are curing foods, like I alluded to last chapter when it came to like long cure salami, salumis, things like that. And if you're doing any custom animal processing, like the deer for people to use personally, things along those lines, you're going to need that variance and that HACCP plan to go along with it as well. Some other ones that come into there, we talked about if you're using reduced oxygen packaging, even sous vide. Now it depends on the time that it takes, how long you're going for the sous vide. And, is it something regular? Is it something special? But you still, it's a good point to develop a HACCP plan for your sous vide items, just so again, you're trying to be proactive and help prevent people from getting sick through the processes that are going on. Remember, if it's fresh juice on site, you're going to sell later, unless it has the warning label, you need that HACCP and variance. Same with your sprouting seeds or beans, or offering those live shellfish from the display tank. Okay, so, HACCP is big. It's something that's a huge part of sanitation. It's the way that we show what we're doing every day as far as the time temperature principles, and that we're not doing time temperature abuse, cross-contamination, things along those lines. HACCP is the way we document it and show the health department and show the world, so to speak, of what we're doing to help keep our customers from getting sick. Well, now the flip side of this is what happens if we come into a crisis situation, and this is crisis management. So crisis management, we would like to think that, it's never going to happen to us. It could very well happen. It could very well happen that something's going to be a crisis that the business needs to respond to. All right. And so whether it's a foodborne illness outbreak, maybe there's a power outage, there's a fire, there's sewer backup. These are all considered crises. These are things we're not planning for, but sometimes they happen. But if we think about them ahead of time and we come up with a plan of how we're going to take care of it if it happens, then it puts us in a better situation when or if it actually occurs. So when we're putting together this crisis management program, we look at 3 phases: how we prepare, how we respond, and how we recover. Prepare, respond, recover. Of course, just like everything else you've heard me talk about today in this chapter, we got to create a written plan. It's not just what's in our head. We actually have it in writing, so people know this is the policy, this is the way that we will handle these different crises. And then, of course, you want to make sure you're testing the plan to ensure it works. That doesn't mean, make somebody sick and see how it goes, but, simulate something happening and go into the proper procedures and making sure it makes sense. Because one thing on paper, is sometimes a totally different thing when it's actually happening in real life. Does it actually make sense, and does it actually work for us, or does it hinder us in the end? So what we typically look at is we create a crisis management team. So these are people that are going to be the go-to when it comes to if a crisis happens. Now, the size of this team is going to depend on the operation. In a huge operation, you're going to have a lot of different crisis management team members because you have to have them for different areas. If you're in a smaller operation, it might just be, you said, you see here, the chef, the general manager, the owner operator, maybe the front of the house manager. It's just that management team that is there. Okay. When you're creating a crisis management team, also look at external resources, your regulatory authorities. If you're creating, let's say, a crisis management for a fire, involve the fire department or involve the fire marshal and get that person's expertise on it, on ways that you can handle if something like that would happen, and also looking at prevention and stuff too. If you have experts in the supplier or manufacturer area that you can reach out to, again, that's another great avenue that you potentially have at your fingertips for it. Okay. So how do we prepare? So first and foremost, you have to have an emergency contact list. Okay. And that contact list needs to be posted by the phones that are in your establishment. Okay. It should include the name and the number of those team members. It should have whoever is the media spokesperson, whoever's management or HQ personnel if it's a big business. It should also have any outside resources like testing labs, police, fire, health department, things like that should be all on there. Okay. We need to make sure you're creating a crisis communication plan. So a crisis communication plan lists the media responses or question and answer sheet, what to say for each crisis. Because you need to make sure, and we talk about this more in management as well, but you need to make sure that it's coming, as far as from your restaurant, it's coming from typically one person, and that person is speaking on behalf of the restaurant, and that you're looking at ways that you can make sure you're trying not to be blindsided by things, and how you can try to, damage control as much as possible as well when it comes to those. You appoint that spokesperson that communicates to the media, and you instruct everybody else to direct questions to that spokesperson. All right. So if, the media is there and they are talking to one of the cooks that are outside, the cook needs to say, you need to go speak to so-and-so. They're the representative for the restaurant. All right. And then what you need to put together is a crisis kit. Okay. And a lot of times what you see there, that 3-ring binder, something like that, that is what your crisis kit is. And it has all the planned material. It has all the documentation, everything that you need in case a crisis would happen. So to prepare for a foodborne illness outbreak, first off, we need to make sure we're developing the food safety program with the HACCP and everything, making sure we're training staff on policies and procedures. We also need to create an illness incident report and train the staff how to use it. It's always good to get some legal advice on developing this, because you don't want to make sure that you have things that shouldn't be asked or what things should be asked, especially if a foodborne illness results in somebody passing away, or there's a lawsuit or something along those lines. So it's always good to get legal guidance when it comes to developing an incident report for foodborne illness. So the report should have what and when the customer ate at the operation, when the customer first got sick, what their symptoms were, how long they experienced those symptoms, when they sought medical attention, what other food was eaten by the customer. And those are some of the basic things. You might add more, but again, it's better to seek legal advice to make sure that you are not asking questions that maybe you shouldn't be. Okay. So something happens when responding to a crisis. The crisis management team gets together and then you implement that plan that's in that binder, right? You collect the information, you plan the course of action, and then manage the events as they unfold. So, for example, if something major happens, you're involved with it, you're probably gonna get media calls. So you want to make sure you're working with the media and make sure that that person, that whoever's that spokesperson is fully informed of everything. You want to make sure that you're careful about what you say, stick to the facts of information, be honest. If you don't have all the facts, don't lie, say so. Say, at this point, we don't have all the facts. We are still gathering, information, or whatever that case may be. Let them know that you'll, communicate with them with more information. Remember, they have a job, but the last thing you want to do is get defensive about stuff. And I know, especially in a crisis situation like this, it's tough not to. But you want to make sure that that's not what you're coming off as, is being overly defensive about stuff, because people are going to notice that stuff, right? You want to make sure you have direct communication with your key audiences. So remember, the media is going to put their information out. You don't rely on them to put all the information out. Remember, they're going to have a story. So make sure you put out your side of the story to anybody that is your key audience. Newsletters, website, flyers, social media, advertising, whatever the case may be. Communicate directly with your key audience. Don't necessarily use the media as the go-between, because their message might not be the message exactly that you want coming out to your customers. Okay. And then fix the problem. Okay. Find the solution. And then once that problem's been fixed, communicate to the media, to your customers, what you've done to fix that problem. Every time that you reach a step and you're at the next stage as far as fixing a problem, let the media know, let your customers know. Hold small briefings just so people can know what's going into it. And just make sure that if you're doing briefings, that you're in control, that you're not just like, okay, who has questions? Have stuff to talk about when it comes to that. So some if and then. So for foodborne illness, if a customer calls to report a foodborne illness, first off, you want to make sure you take the complaint seriously. Okay. Do not, I repeat, do not admit responsibility. We don't know that for sure. We don't know what else that person's eaten. We don't know what their, lifestyle is like, if there's other things that contributed to it, whatever the case may be. Ask for general contact information, and then complete that foodborne illness incident report form. Make sure you have those things going on. If a similar customer complains of foodborne illness, then we definitely need to make sure the team is involved, because we look at identifying what common food items and determining the source of the complaint. And we need to contact the health department, our regulatory authority, to assist with the investigation, because if we think an outbreak is suspected, we do need to get the health department involved. I know you're like, I don't want to get the health department involved. You don't want to, but you need to, okay, if it gets to that point. So if that suspected food is still in the operation, make sure you set it aside, identify it so we don't use it anymore. Label it, do not use, do not discard. So people know that, hey, we're not using it, but I don't want you to throw it away. Make sure you log any information about the description, when it came in, the product date, the lot number, because again, it might not be something that your staff did. It might be a product issue. It might be that, there was ground beef that got E. coli at a processing facility, and we ended up getting that ground beef. Somebody ordered their burger medium rare, and they end up getting sick with it. Well, I mean, assuming you have that warning on your menu, you tell them that there's an increased risk, but we still need to report it to the health department, especially if there's multiples, because if it did come from a manufacturing facility, there's other places that have that, and they want to make sure that they can set up a recall. So it might not be our fault. Okay. We don't know that, but we also want to make sure we're not, quote, getting rid of evidence, right? Okay. If possible, obtain samples of suspected food from the customer if they have leftovers or things like that, just so you can turn other things into the health department. If the suspected outbreak is caused by a sick staff member, make sure you maintain a list of food handlers scheduled at the time of the contamination, so you know who else might have been exposed. Talk to those people about their health status and exclude suspected staff from operations, making sure you're following the SOPs of your establishment. If the regulatory authority, if the health department confirms your operation is the source of the outbreak, cooperate with the authorities to resolve it and provide appropriate documentation, your temperature logs, your HACCP documents, staff files, everything else. Again, work with them to see about getting this taken care of and getting it resolved. Okay, so what happens? A crisis happens. We got foodborne illness outbreak. How do we recover and how do we assess it? So like I said earlier, work with the regulatory authority to resolve the issue. Make sure all areas are clean and sanitized, like thorough deep cleaning. Any food that is suspect, throw it out. When in doubt, throw it out. Investigate to find the cause of the outbreak on your end. Of course, the health department is going to be doing their investigation as well, but we can start doing some within internal as well. Look at your food handling procedures and either establish new procedures, because if the old ones are not doing what they should, or revise existing ones based upon the results of the investigation. And then develop a plan to reassure customers that the food served in your operation is safe. Oh, that's a tough one though, because I'll tell you right now, once your restaurant is attached to a foodborne illness outbreak, it's tough to get rid of that stigma. And we've had it happen in Peoria. Many moons ago, back in the 80s, there was a place over by Northwoods Mall called the Skewer Inn. And the Skewer Inn had a foodborne illness outbreak of botulism. They traced it back actually to grilled onions. So they grilled some onions on a flat top, and instead of holding it at 135 or higher, they just left them over to the side of the flat top where it wasn't on. Okay. And then there was oil and stuff on it. And so it created a environment for anaerobic bacteria, in this case, botulism, to grow. And then when it came time to serve some of those onions a few hours later, instead of throwing them back on the hot part of the grill and, heating them, getting them back up above 135 to maybe get rid of some of the bacteria that might have been on there, they just put them on the sandwich, sent them out. Okay. And so you can kind of guess what happened with that. Well, I know after all of it happened, people wouldn't go back. Like, they tried what they could to get people to come back. Hey, we've changed our policy, blah, 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 blah. All this is, we're better than we were as far as our procedures and stuff. Nobody would give them a second chance because they made multiple people sick. I think even one or two died or something, or they were severely like hospitalized type of thing. So it's something that you need to take seriously. And here's the kicker too. If you are the chef and a foodborne illness outbreak happens on your watch in your kitchen, guess who they're going to associate with? They're not going to associate it necessarily with the cooks or the dishwasher or the front of the house manager or the servers or anything like that. You as the chef are going to be labeled as the person that made people sick. Even if it wasn't you, it was one of your cooks, maybe, at least in the Skewer Inn's incidents, assuming the chef wasn't cooking, but you're still in charge of that kitchen. Okay. So, yes, we want to make sure that we have a plan in place, but do know if it's a foodborne illness outbreak, it's going to be tough. Well, if you can even recover from it. So I hate to be a downer on that, but I want you to understand the severity of what happens if a foodborne illness outbreak occurs and how it affects your business and how it affects you as a professional. So that's why you got to take the sanitation seriously. I know it's not the most exciting stuff to listen to me talk about, but it's so important, because if we make our customers sick, it doesn't matter how good the food looks or how yummy it tastes, they're not going to come back. So what if we have imminent health hazard? So a significant threat or danger to the health to prevent injury. So if we have an immediate imminent health hazard, we need to stop service. We need to notify whatever regulatory authority is there, and we get rid of any spoiled or contaminated food, especially food and packaging that is not intact. So things such as a power outage. If we have a power outage, what do we need to be thinking about in that crisis management plan? Can we get access to a generator or refrigeration? Right. Can we prepare a menu with items that do not require cooking, at least temporarily? Is there policies that address when the cooler doors should be open? Because with the coolers, they have insulation around them that even if they go down, they should maintain temperature for a decent amount of time. But if you're going in and out, that's obviously decreasing the amount of time that it will maintain temperature, and you're not keeping your food in the temperature danger zone. If you have water or electrical interruptions, you can restart service. If you have a pre-approved written emergency operating plan, you take immediate corrective action and you notify the health department when that plan has been implemented. That's another big, we don't think about it. Water is very, very important. We need water to wash our hands. We need water for our beverages in most cases. We need water to wash our dishes. We need water for the restrooms, all of these different things. And it needs to be potable water. It needs to be water that's fit for human consumption in one way, shape, or form in order for it to be able to be used. So, it can be very, very serious when it comes to things along those lines. So if the refrigeration stops working, record the time the power went out, check and record the temperatures periodically, keep the doors closed, pack TCS foods and any ice that you can purchase or that you have to help hedge your bet to keep your food as cold as possible. If the ventilation hoods or fans stop working, you have to stop cooking. That's just the thing. If not, you're getting smoke in, you're getting potentially noxious fumes and stuff going in that could make people sick or even hurt them. So if the ventilation hoods or the fan stop working, we have to stop cooking. If our hot holding equipment stops working, again, record the time that the power went out, throw out any TCS foods that are below 135 for more than 4 hours. And if food can be reheated if the power outage was less than 4 hours. So as long as it's less than 4 hours, we can reheat the food. If it's over 4 hours, we got to pitch it. If the power outage happens, make sure you have a plan for recovery. So again, checking refrigeration units after the power is restored to make sure that they can maintain product temperatures, that it hasn't messed up their systems and now they're not keeping the right temperature. Making sure you're throwing out TCS foods that were in the temperature danger zone for longer than 4 hours. If you have to prepare as far as trying to be thinking about it, if it's a water service interruption, what stuff requires little to no water? What types of single-use items and bottled water to keep? Do you have a supplier who can provide bottled water and an ice for an emergency? Emergency contact information, of course, you want to have. Developing procedures that minimize water during the emergency, and working with the health department to develop an emergency hand washing procedure as well. So if you cannot wash your hands, then you would implement the emergency hand washing procedure that you and the health department have agreed to. If toilets do not flush, are there other restrooms that the staff can use during operation hours? If the restrooms are not available, you have to stop operations because you have to have working restrooms in order for the restaurant to be operational. If drinking water is not available or there's contaminated, you could use bottled water. You could use water from an approved reputable supplier, making sure you're keeping the water in a covered, sanitized container during hauling or storage so it does not get contaminated. If you have food that needs water in order to be made, anything that's made with water before the contamination was discovered, you want to throw that out because you're not for sure if it's good or not. And then bottled or boiled water for ready to eat foods is always a good rule of thumb. If water is not available, find another approved reputable supplier. emergency menu where you're not having to use necessarily a lot of water, pre-washed, pre-packaged produce, frozen or canned fruits and vegetables, and then thaw foods only in a cooler or microwave or as part of the cooking process. Again, these are things that it could happen, but maybe not, but we want to make sure that we are being prepared for it. If ice can't be made, get rid of the existing ice and use ice from an approved reputable supplier. If we can't clean or sanitize our utensils, equipment in the facility, single-use items, so single-use forks and things like that, bottled water or water from approved source to clean and sanitize. If beverages made with water can't be prepared, of course, you want to stop using the drink machines, coffee makers, things that are auto-filled as well if the water is not good for us to use. Okay. So we want to make sure we are cleaning and sanitizing equipment that have water line connections. So our spray misters, our tea or coffee urns, ice machines, et cetera, et cetera. And the manufacturer will have instructions on how to clean those lines. We want to make sure we're flushing the water lines as required by the health department before we start using water coming out of those lines. And of course, work with the health department to resume our normal operations. If we have a fire, we need to make sure we have our emergency contact information there at the phone, fire and police department. Of course, we need to also have the health department information there, and then management or crisis team personnel information. And the fire department number should be by each phone. Of course, 911 is another option as well. If there's a fire, you got to throw out any food that's been affected by it. Also damaged utensils, linens, and items that cannot be cleaned and sanitized. We need a deep clean and sanitize operation. Sometimes it's necessary to hire an outside service that deals with cleaning up after fires. Of course, we want to check the water lines to make sure they're all still good. There's no issues or anything along those lines. If you have a flood, make sure we have a plan for flood control equipment, plumbing, storm drains, sump pumps, making sure that emergency contact information, keeping a supply of bottled water is always a good idea. When we talk about flood, if there's a water line leak that builds on the floor, keep people away from it, repair the leak, and block off the areas. If a flood affects or damages food or utensils, we have to stop operations, unfortunately. If the flood is a result of sewage backup, then we need to close that area right away, correct the problem, and clean it and sanitize it accordingly. Any damaged utensils, linens, items cannot be cleaned, needs to be thrown away. We throw out any food or food packaging that came in contact with water. Clean and sanitize the facility, all the utensils, equipment, surfaces, floors, or other affected areas. And again, if need be, hire that janitorial service that cleans up, that specializes in cleanup such as that. Again, a lot of information, that HACCP is extremely important. But we also need to be thinking about crisis management, because as much as like I said earlier, as much as we hope it doesn't happen, there is that possibility, and we want to make sure we are prepared for that. So that is the end of chapter 10.